ladies and gentlemen, over the last 2.5 years, we have seen a deliberate policy of this government to attack our democracy, to challenge the rule of law, and as a result of it, that they are undermining the national security of our country. I don't have to remind solutions as to what the state of crime is in this country and what we know the normal causes of crime. But the type of crime that we're seeing has had the added impetus, I think, of the arrogant, inept, incompetent, and unlawful actions of this government. Let us remember from the beginning of the results of the election. One of the first individuals to come out to speak was Pierre. And he said that he had suffered in opposition and that his reputation had been maligned and that there were persons who attacked him, and that now that he was in a position of power, that he could use that power to go after people. Not my words. Those are his words. You would have thought that a person who just won an election on putting people first, that it would have been the people's business, that would have been the first thing he would address, not his own personal vendettas. We saw that the Prime Minister and the Speaker of the House went to a court hearing, and in his own words, to ensure that justice was being done. A Prime Minister and a Speaker of the House. Something as sacred as the separation between the judiciary and the political, the executive and parliamentarians. We saw the suspension of the Emergency Act. And again now, I want solutions to maybe have a greater appreciation of what the opposition was saying. The Emergency Act is something that is specifically outlined in the Constitution. And it is there that when government has to take away any of the civil liberties of a citizen, that it must do in a state of emergency. And the fundamental part of that state of emergency is the reporting. So let me give you the comparison. The Suppression Act that was created for crime in Vieux Fort, which gives ordinary police officers extraordinary powers to go into your home, to put you under house arrest, to search your vehicle, to prevent you from walking or using your car. That has been in place for over a year. Now, in a state of emergency, there is a legal requirement that the police must keep a record of every time that they suppress a person's civil rights. So every single time that a police officer would confine somebody to their home, every time a police officer would go through somebody's home, search somebody's home, or search somebody's body, which would normally need a police warrant, that they are doing this and there's no record. 1 year. Can anybody tell us how many times police officers have confined people to their home? How many times police officers have searched people's homes without a warrant or searched individuals without a warrant? That is why the state of emergency is such an important part of our Constitution. And this government knowingly introduced a Suppression Act and have deprived persons in the South of their civil liberties and have kept no record and have given no reports to the general public and to account for their actions. Very recently, my court case, where the Attorney General wrote to the registrar complaining about how my case was implemented. That the Department of Justice, the Ministry of Justice, attempted to move the judge's clerk. That unprecedentedly, the judge came to the court and complained of political interference, highlighting these unusual actions by an Attorney General, and recused himself. And what have we now seen? That same judge now has been transferred to Grenada. So the fact that he was transferred to Grenada suggests to all of us that he didn't do anything wrong. But the optics of having a judge transferred, a judge that ruled against the government, the optics of that is damning on something as important as the separation of the judiciary from the executive. The SLP government have become dictators in our country. And they are blaring examples where some of us can describe that we're living in a police state. I call on all right-thinking solutions today to take an account of what has happened over the last 2.5 years and to take this situation seriously. If we don't have a rule of law, if we don't have separation of powers, and if we don't stand up for those things, then we live in anarchy. Every man for himself, every man and every woman for themselves. So I bring that up because of what has recently transpired, and in particular, the statements that were made by Richard Frederick on his weekly show last Thursday. And first of all, we must remember that it was the same Richard Frederick in his resignation speech, if you remember, when he was in government in 2006 to 2011, that started off his speech by saying, I was a police officer and I was a lawyer. It's very important. He was, and everybody knows that he was a police officer. And everyone knows that he's been a lawyer for a long period of time. I want to read something which was an interview that Timothy Polio had in about 2005 with the then Prime Minister Kenny Anthony. And that was right after the by-elections and before the elections in 2006. And I'm reading it because of his description of Richard Frederick at that time. And he said, regardless of who we are, whenever we enter into public life, people turn us upside down, people turn us inside out. They look at you in every different direction, every facet. They're interested in your personal life. They become interested in your public life. Now I'm going to digress just a little, but I'll come to the heart of the matter. I believe that the Labour Party has a responsibility when it is contesting a general election, or any election for that matter, to share with the electorate its views on candidates. United Workers' Party has every right to look at the candidates of the St. Lucia Labour Party to share their views about those candidates. Character is always an issue in politics. It is always an issue to the electorate, and so I would think that Richard Frederick should not be immune from that process. He's entered into the political arena. He's entered into political life. Therefore, the Labour Party has a responsibility to the people at large to say, look, you must evaluate this candidate. This is what we know about this candidate, Richard Frederick. This is what we are concerned about this candidate. You must feel deep in your heart and in your conscience that you did the right thing to vote for that person. If after you've this amount of information and you decide to vote for that person, then we have to respect your judgment and accept your judgment. Just as, for example, we've accepted the judgment of the people of Central Castries in the outcome of the by-election. If you remember that Richard Frederick had won a by-election. Now what is the frightening part that I refer to? Quite apart from those issues, when I spoke about being frightening, remember, he indicated that Richard Frederick was the most frightening thing to happen in politics in St. Lucia. I really meant the history of Richard Frederick. Richard Frederick has had several encounters where firearms have been used. Take, for example, the case which went before the court, and you recall that the judge suggested that Richard was short-tempered. The judge rejected his account of the events. Means that the judge basically said that he lied. Call it what it is. This judge referred to the fact that he utilized a firearm, and he was appealing that decision. An appeal that we now know that he lost. And I don't want to say any more about that, but that's a fact. Then, too, you have the incident at Burger Plus, where Richard is alleged of accosting some security guard at Burger Plus. It is reported on the front page of The Voice. A firearm was pulled out there, were suggestions that he would use the firearm that he had, and he was frustrated. And of course, a recent incident involving Lang boys, again, that was reported in The Voice. We know, following that, there was an event that took place that has become now common known in our country as Operation Restore Confidence. A policy of the then United Workers' Party, headed by the then Prime Minister Stephenson King. And Operation Restore Confidence, the then Labour Party, accused Stephenson King, and in particular Richard Frederick, of establishing a hit list, and that police officers had been instructed to kill citizens of this country. So much so that the information that the Labour Party provided to the US government, to the British government, the French, Europeans, and the Canadians, that the Americans turned around and before the elections in 2011 withdrew the visa of Richard Frederick, both his personal visa as well as his diplomatic visa. And that when the Labour Party won the election, there was an expectation by those same international countries that the government was going to hold the police officers, politicians, and business people that were alleged to have been involved in this case accountable. And when in 2013, because remember the government won at the end of 2011, and by 2013, the U.S. government grew frustrated and imposed what we now know today as the Leahy Law on St. Lucia. And that Leahy Law withdrew the participation of St. Lucia in any regional training and imposed visa restrictions on the officers that they believed were involved, specifically the hierarchy of the police force. As a result of that, the then Prime Minister Kenny Anthony agreed to bring Jamaican officers to investigate the Operation Restore Confidence and the allegations that were being made. And remember, Dr. Anthony is a lawyer and had previously been a prime minister for 2 terms. And Kenny Anthony also taught constitutional law. So it is difficult for me to ever believe that he did not know that the entity in our Constitution that's responsible for that investigation, overseeing the investigation, would be the DPP's office. Now, normally it would be the local police, but we would have understood if the police were the ones that were being accused, it would be difficult for them to investigate themselves. Those Jamaican police officers came in here, and as a result of it, there was a report that was produced called Impacts. And probably one of the most damning things that came out of the Impacts, and I believe that when Dr. Anthony gave his speech, an address to the nation, one of the first things that he said was what? That his allegations that there was a hit list that he said that he saw before the elections in 2011, that they verified and validated that statement. They went on to say in that report that there were corrupt politicians, there were corrupt business people, and they were corrupt police officers that were colluding Now, I say all of this because of what we've seen transpire last week, where the same Richard Frederick revealed that he was receiving information from police officers. Personal information of citizens of this country. We also know that Richard Frederick has been on a tirade of attacking public citizens. We're clearly aware of the persons from United Workers' Party that he's attacked. But more recently, he's made public his attacks on Barbara Jacobs and Richard Peterkin, Jan Gustav, ordinary citizens of St. Lucia. This revelation by Richard, it's so egregious. It's so reckless. It's so dangerous that as the leader of the opposition, I've had no choice but to pen a letter to the Commissioner of Police. And I'd like to read that letter. This letter has been sent off to the Commissioner of Police today, and it's been copied to the Prime Minister and the Minister of National Security, the Minister of Home Affairs, the President of the Bar Association, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, the chairman of the Integrity Commission, as well as the chairman of the Public Service Commission. And the letter reads the following. I write on behalf of the opposition of the United Workers' Party and the public at large in reference to certain alarming statements made by the Member of Parliament for Castries Central, Honourable Richard Frederick, during the October 12, 2023 broadcast of his television show, Can I Help You? During the show, he boasted that he'd been receiving and collating confidential information from police officers on private citizens. This statement not only brings our executive branch and the minister into disrepute, but is also an offense under the Section 3 of the Police Regulatory Cap 1401 of the revised laws of St. Lucia, which deals with the confidentiality of information, among other things. Our citizenry trust in the police force is predicated upon the expectation that its members execute their duties fairly, independently, prudently, without fear or favor, and that they will uphold their oath to protect us all. The admission made by Minister Frederick of this unlawful alliance is deeply concerning, as it suggests collusion between a minister of government and those responsible for our safety and national security, whose duty it is to keep such information secret. It further confirms that confidential information, not meant for public consumption, has been shared unlawfully with a government minister. There are widespread fears that the same minister who has been on public rampage targeting political rivals and other persons critical of him and the Labour Party administration is using his access to confidential police information to intimidate and threaten such persons. Given the gravity of the allegations made by the minister, combined with previous threats made by him against members of the public, I am formally calling upon you, as the Commissioner of Police, if you have already not done so, to immediately launch an investigation into this matter and to lay charges against all offenders. This egregious situation, if left unchecked, will have serious implications for the integrity of and public confidence in our police force. The rule of law and the protection enshrined in our Constitution as it relates to the separation of powers. Your immediate action is required to preserve our national security. The St. Lucian public deserves nothing less. I think that those words and this letter speaks for itself. And it speaks volumes, hopefully, that persons understand the precarious situation that these remarks, allegations, comments have put our democracy in. It is rocking the core of our democracy and the separation of powers. Those separations of powers are there for a reason. And they are persons in our system that are responsible for the checks and balances. And I'm calling on all of those persons to react immediately to this confession that Richard Frederick has made. There's no doubt that he's done it. And given the previous allegations that were made against Richard Frederick as it pertained to Operation Restore Confidence, that the U.S. government clearly must have believed because they took away his visas. Allegations that the Labour Party made against two individuals, Stephenson King and Richard Frederick, and that those same individuals today are in this government's cabinet. I want to say for those persons who may not genuinely understand the implications of what has transpired, let me use maybe a more simpler analogy. When somebody steals goods and they go to sell those goods to someone else, if the person that they're selling it to suspects or knows that they are stolen goods and still buys those goods, they're complicit, meaning they are just as guilty as the people who stole the goods in the first place. What we don't know is that the collusion between the police officers that Richard made reference to and himself, voluntarily, or were they bribed? I don't know. But it's a good question to ask. And therefore, if it is a bribe, there's even deeper implications in this situation. This is dangerous. This is undermining the national security of our country. It is undermining the rule of law. So I'm going to end on this last statement. Yes. My colleague is reminding me that the extraction of information illegally didn't start today. We know that when we were in government, there was an example where Richard went on his show and displayed documents that came from cabinet. But more importantly, he displayed documents from DSH's bank account. And the officer at the bank that was involved in doing that was fired. So this is a gentleman that has had a habit of obtaining information illegally. But in this particular case, that he would have gotten the support of public officers who have an oath of allegiance to the public and to the Constitution of St. Lucia is really now beyond the pale. But I want to say this. Our faith in the Prime Minister is waning because the amount of lies that he's been caught in. But one thing that he's been consistent in saying is that he wants to be transparent and he's not going to tolerate any corruption in his cabinet. And if there was ever proof against any one of his ministers, he would immediately fire them. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, one of your ministers has provided you with the proof. The admission that he colluded, whether it's voluntarily or through bribery, to get and obtain information from the police force on private citizens, his admission that he's collecting files on those persons, and the action that he's been attacking citizens of this country is more than sufficient. And whether you want to accept it or not, is unlawful. It is illegal. It is an act of corruption. It is undermining the authority of our state. And we are expecting you to redeem yourself
show us that there is some hope for St. Lucia. Some hope that somewhere inside of you, that there's some strength to do the right thing. And to end this nightmare of Richard Frederick and political life in St. Lucia. He is nothing but a menace to society. He has lied on a continual basis. He has manipulated people. He is manipulating the law. And I'm asking you to do the right thing today and to fire Richard Frederick and live up to the promise that you've made to the public of St. Lucia. I know you've not lived up to many promises, but this is one promise that you have to live up to for the sake of St. Lucia. Thank you.